She said nothing while they arrested her, until backup arrived and everything changed. The morning air was sharp, carrying the early chill of February through the quiet streets of a Modest neighborhood in Austin, Texas. Rebecca Collins stepped out of her townhouse just before 7 o'clock in the morning, dressed in a slate-gray trench coat and clutching a steaming travel mug. Her auburn hair was tied back in a practical bun, her expression focused as she prepared for another day at the environmental engineering firm where she had worked for over a decade. It was a routine morning, or so it seemed, across the street. An idling black SUV suddenly revved its engine. Another vehicle blocked the far end of the street, and within seconds, 4 federal agents emerged in coordinated motion. One of them called her name, Rebecca Collins. Loud enough to rattle the neighborhood into attention. The mug slipped from her fingers, shattering on the concrete. She raised her hands, confused but compliant, her gaze flicking between the badges and the drawn weapons. The entire scene unfolded. In less than a minute, Rebecca was handcuffed, patted down, and read her rights while neighbors peeked through blinds or stepped onto porches. The morning quiet gave way to murmurs of disbelief and speculation. A retired couple across the street whispered to each other about how Rebecca had always seemed so polite, so reserved. A teenager next door recorded the scene on his phone, uploading it within minutes. By the time the agents guided her into the back of the SUV, the local news was already receiving anonymous tips. Rebecca said nothing. Not when they told her she was under arrest for suspicion of federal cybercrime. Not when she was asked if she had any electronics on her person. Not even when one of the agents, a younger man who seemed unsettled by the silence, tried to meet her eyes and reassure her this was just procedure. She kept her head straight, her lips sealed, her eyes locked on some distant thought only she could see. Inside the SUV, the air was thick with tension. Agent Kimberly Holt, who had led the operation, reviewed the arrest warrant once more as they pulled onto the freeway. The warrant had been authorized based on what internal investigators called compelling evidence linking Rebecca to the unauthorized access and dissemination of classified government data. According to their sources, the breach had exposed sensitive environmental policy discussions, ones that could damage international negotiations and domestic regulatory contracts. But Rebecca had no criminal history, no financial red flags, and no visible affiliations with activist groups. Her professional record was impeccable. That contradiction gnawed at Agent Holt, who'd carried out dozens of similar arrests before, but rarely encountered someone so composed or so utterly silent. At the downtown federal holding facility, Rebecca was fingerprinted, photographed, and placed in a temporary holding cell. She did not protest, she answered no questions. Even when provided with water and offered the opportunity to make a phone call, she declined. Her silence was not one of confusion, nor did it suggest panic. It was deliberate, like a switch she had flipped long before the agents arrived at her. Meanwhile, word of the arrest began to ripple through federal channels. A junior prosecutor named Alan Travers was assigned to the case, and within hours he began reviewing the sparse but dramatic preliminary file. A respected environmental engineer linked to a leak that had triggered security alarms in Washington. But as he read through the documents and looked at Rebecca's professional background, something felt off. The timestamps of the alleged data transfers, the vague metadata, the lack of concrete digital fingerprints, none of it added up, and Rebecca's refusal to speak only deepened the mystery. Back at the holding cell, a female officer entered with a calm voice, informing Rebecca that her assigned defense attorney would be arriving shortly. Still, there was no response, not even a glance. Rebecca sat on the edge of the cot, hands resting on her lap as if waiting, but for what? No one could say. Outside the facility, television crews began to gather, fueled by speculation and internet gossip. Social media swelled with conflicting narratives. Some called her a whistleblower, others a traitor. Her name trended by noon. Yet in the eye of this brewing storm, Rebecca Collins sat still, silent and utterly unreadable. As the first day of her arrest closed, the authorities had only more questions. Why had someone like her, with no previous signs of dissent or misconduct, suddenly become the central figure in what could evolve into a national scandal? And why, in the face of everything, did she say nothing? She had not yet spoken a single word, but the silence itself was beginning to echo louder than any denial or confession. The holding cell was small, featureless, and cold. Pale fluorescent lights hummed softly above, casting a sterile glow on the concrete floor and cinder block walls. A narrow bench lined one side of the room, and on it sat Rebecca Collins, motionless. Her posture was upright, composed, her hands resting palm down on her thighs. Time passed without her asking for it. Food had been brought and left untouched. Her face remained unreadable, a mask of calm that neither faltered nor cracked. Outside, the cell. Federal agents came and went, whispering updates, trading theories. Several had expected resistance, even tears. Instead, they were met with an unsettling quiet. Agent Holt returned mid-afternoon with a digital folder containing more case materials, hoping a new angle might provoke some response. She entered the observation room adjacent to the holding cell, studying Rebecca through the one-way glass. There was no pacing, no signs of anxiety. Rebecca seemed to be waiting for something, or someone. Alan Travers arrived at the same hour, carrying a folder brimming with hastily gathered evidence and his own growing skepticism. He was only 32, but already known for a methodical approach and a quiet persistence in high-pressure cases. He reviewed the digital trail cited in the arrest warrant. The breach had occurred 2 weeks earlier. An internal database, heavily protected, containing reports on federal environmental policy drafts, had been accessed without clearance. The IP address matched a location frequently associated with Rebecca's home. But the connection was too neat. Too quick. By 4 o'clock, her court-appointed attorney, Marcus Levy, entered the cell block, briefcase in hand, nerves simmering beneath a thin veneer of professionalism. Marcus had defended clients who screamed, who cried, who begged. This woman did none of that. He introduced himself, sat across from her, and waited for a sign, a glance, a nod, anything. Rebecca remained still. He leaned forward, voice low. "Steady. Ms. Collins, I need to understand what's going on so I can help you. You've been arrested on federal charges. They're building a serious case. If you don't speak up, they're going to control the entire narrative." She met his eyes then, just for a moment, then looked away. "This isn't just a misunderstanding," he continued. "They believe you accessed restricted files, shared them with an outside group, and violated national data protection laws. This could lead to years, decades, in prison. But silence won't protect you." She turned her head slightly, her first real motion in hours, and looked at the far wall as if it held the answer to a question unspoken. Marcus pressed his hands together. "Whatever you're trying to do, whatever strategy this is, you need to let me in on it. If you won't speak to them, at least speak to me. We need to challenge the arrest, request discovery, examine the chain of evidence. I need you." Rebecca remained silent. By 6 o'clock, Agent Holt grew frustrated. "She's playing a game," she muttered to Travers, "trying to bait us into mistakes. Or maybe she's waiting for outside pressure to build. Maybe her silence is a message." Travers disagreed but said nothing. He stared at her file, noting dates, inconsistencies, timestamps that didn't quite align. He highlighted entries, underlined witness reports that contradicted themselves, flagged logs that lacked context. Rebecca was being framed, or at the least scapegoated. Of that he was increasingly certain. But her silence, while perhaps strategic, was making his job harder. Back in the holding cell, night had fallen. Rebecca lay on the bench, eyes closed but not asleep. She could hear the hum of the security camera, the soft beeps of distant keypads. Every few hours someone checked on her, but she didn't react. In her mind, the silence was not a void. It was armor. Words could be twisted, intentions misread, any slip could be used against her. She had learned that before in quieter battles behind office doors, in meetings where truth was buried under convenience and compromise. Speaking had cost her once, not again. Now she would speak only when the time was right. Marcus returned the following morning, more insistent. "I'm filing motions to delay formal charges. We're requesting the forensic logs. But if you won't talk, they're going to push through with the indictment. They think you're hiding something. That kind of silence, it looks guilty. Rebecca didn't flinch. She simply adjusted her posture and stared past him. Outside, pressure mounted. Media began calling her a data thief. Environmental groups whispered that maybe she had been trying to blow the whistle on something bigger. Government spokespeople refused to comment. But all eyes were on the woman who wouldn't speak, the accused who wouldn't deny. Holt and Travers scheduled an interrogation session, hoping to provoke a response. 2 agents, 1 recorder, and a lawyer present. They asked her again about the breach, about the files, about the environmental policy reports that had somehow found their way into the hands of activists. They played audio recordings, presented printed copies of emails, showed her photos of a USB drive recovered near her apartment. Rebecca remained silent through it all. Agent Holt leaned forward, voice tightening. "We know it was you. We have the access logs. We have witnesses. The only thing left is your confession. That's how this ends." But it didn't end. Rebecca stared at the table, hands folded back straight. No confession came, no denial, just silence. And somewhere in the stillness, something began to shift. They didn't know it yet, but the silence wasn't surrender. It was a countdown. The air inside the federal facility conference room was dense with anticipation as Rebecca Collins was escorted in, hands cuffed at the front, her face void of any visible reaction. It was mid-morning, and sunlight filtered in through a narrow window touching only the far edge of Thetabal. Across from her sat 2 federal prosecutors, 1 lead investigator, and a representative from the Department of Homeland Security. To her right, Marcus Levy sat rigid, frustration mounting behind his calm expression. He had begged her to say something, anything. But Rebecca had refused once more, leaving him to defend a client who had yet to utter a single word in her own case. A heavy manila folder sat in the center of the table, the label marked with bold, red letters, "Confidential, Internal Security Case File." Agent Holt opened it and began, speaking not with menace, but with the weight of bureaucratic certainty. "You are being charged under federal statute for unauthorized access to protected governmental data," she said. "Specifically, on the night of January 3rd, between 10 o'clock in the evening and 1 o'clock in the morning, you accessed servers containing classified environmental policy drafts regarding chemical waste management in federally protected waters. These drafts were subsequently leaked to a known advocacy group, which published excerpts 2 days later." Rebecca did not flinch. Agent Holt continued, "We have forensic evidence indicating a direct connection from your IP address. We also have metadata showing files accessed through your unique employee credentials. And there's this." She slid a printed email across the table. The email, dated 3 days prior to the leak, was a brief message from a private encrypted, addressed to an account used by a known environmental lobbying group. The signature block was blank, but the content referred to specific terminology that had appeared only in those drafts. "Do you deny these charges?" the younger prosecutor asked, leaning forward. Rebecca did not answer. Marcus leaned over and whispered to her again, a final attempt. "Give me something to work with." "They're piling on, you need to." But she didn't move. The prosecutors exchanged a glance. "The charges will be filed today," the older one said. "We're proceeding under the assumption that your silence indicates a refusal to cooperate." When the hearing concluded, Rebecca was returned to her cell. Marcus followed, arguing on the phone with the district clerk's office, trying to delay the formal indictment process. By noon, however, the motion was denied. The case was deemed of high urgency due to national interest. The indictment would proceed within 24 hours. That same afternoon, the Internal Affairs Division released a limited briefing to select members of the press. The story broke on major news outlets. Federal engineers under scrutiny, classified, environmental, reports leaked, national security possibly compromised. Rebecca's name was attached to every headline. Photos from her arrest surfaced online. She became a symbol overnight, but of what no one could yet define. For some, she was a whistleblower betrayed by the system. For others, a traitor who sold secrets under the guise of conscience. Back in her cell, Rebecca sat in the same position she had occupied for hours, Her meals continued to go untouched. Her attorney returned again, pacing this time, anger and concern now tangled in his voice. There, going for the full indictment. Espionage, Rebecca. Espionage, that carries 20 years or more. This isn't symbolic, this is real. And every hour you don't speak, they add more weight to the charges. She turned her head slightly toward him, enough for Marcus to think for a second that she might finally respond. But then she looked away again, expression unchanged. Late that evening, new papers arrived. They detailed the exact nature of the evidence, time-stamped logs, digital fingerprints, employee schedules. And something peculiar stood out to Marcus. The access logs marked her digital signature, active on government servers located in Washington, D.C., while travel records showed she had been booked at a hotel in Chicago at the exact same time. A receipt from the hotel's front desk confirmed her presence there, so did a surveillance image showing her entering the lobby that night. But none of that was mentioned in the official report. He stared at the discrepancy, then at Rebecca's file, then back again. If the timestamps were genuine, it meant someone had used her credentials remotely, likely without her knowledge. But the logs made no note of unusual access patterns, VPN usage, or remote session flags. It was as though the breach had been engineered to appear flawless, clean, seamless, too seamless. Marcus returned to her cell and stood in front of her for nearly 5 minutes without speaking. Then, with quiet intensity, he said, "Someone framed you. This wasn't an accident. They built this from the inside." Rebecca looked up then. Just for a moment. Her eyes met his, and for the first time since her arrest, something passed between them. A silent acknowledgement, maybe even trust. Still, she said nothing. But Marcus understood now. Her silence wasn't passive, it was protection. Not just for herself, but for something or someone else. The indictment arrived the following morning. The charges included unauthorized access to classified information, unlawful distribution of federal data, and conspiracy to undermine regulatory policy through external influence. There was no mention of the discrepancies Marcus had found, no footnotes about the Chicago trip, no clarifications regarding remote access anomalies. Rebecca's arraignment was set for the following week. In the meantime, her silence only deepened the mystery and the danger surrounding her, because now it was no longer about what she had or hadn't done, it was about what she knew and why she refused to say it. The courthouse in downtown Austin was unusually crowded for a preliminary hearing. Journalists lined the front steps, waiting with 5 microphones and cameras angled at every potential figure of interest. Most of them had never heard of Rebecca Collins before her arrest, but now she had become a subject of obsessive national discourse. Not because she spoke or protested, but because she refused to say anything at all. Her silence had transformed her into a cipher, and everyone wanted to decode her. Inside, the courtroom was tense, filled with observers, junior staffers, and federal officers. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a reputation for efficiency and little patience for theatrics, entered promptly and called the session to order. Rebecca was brought in under guard, her wrists uncuffed, but clearly marked by red impressions. She wore a simple, state-issued gray jumpsuit and moved with quiet precision. As always, her face betrayed no emotion. Marcus Levy stood beside her at the defense table, papers in hand, prepared for a procedural battle. He had spent the previous evening assembling a preliminary challenge to the evidence presented during her booking. He would not go as far as calling it fabricated, not yet, but he knew there were holes, and he intended to expose them. The prosecutor began by reaffirming the charges. He spoke of Rebecca's access credentials, the files leaked, the timing of the breach. He described the potential consequences of those documents reaching environmental watchdogs, and how the leak had allegedly impacted negotiations with industrial contractors across several states. Every sentence painted her as a deliberate saboteur. And every time the prosecution emphasized her silence, murmurs spread among the audience like a slow wave of suspicion. Then came Marcus's turn. He approached the bench with a stack of motions and evidence. He presented the hotel receipt from Chicago, the time-stamped surveillance footage, the GPS data from her phone. Each item contradicted the core assumption of the prosecution that Rebecca had been at her home terminal the night of the breach. The judge reviewed the materials carefully. She turned to Rebecca and asked, "You have anything you would like to add at this time?" "Ms. Collins," Rebecca looked at her. There was a pause, brief and weighty. Then she shook her head once, a single definitive motion. The judge pressed, gently. "You understand that your refusal to speak will not be interpreted as cooperation. You are facing serious charges. This is your opportunity to clarify your position before we proceed." Rebecca's expression did not change. She did not nod. She did not shake her head again. She simply held the judge's gaze, unblinking. Marcus stepped in quickly. "Your Honor, my client is choosing to exercise her right to remain silent. However, we argue that her silence does not equate to guilt. The defense submits that critical evidence contradicts the timeline and digital fingerprints attributed to Ms. Collins. We request further forensic examination of the federal access logs." The prosecution objected, citing that the logs had already been verified by internal security. But the judge allowed the motion to be filed for later review. For now, she scheduled the next hearing and denied bail, citing the severity of the allegations. As the gavel struck the block, the courtroom erupted in whispers. Rebecca was escorted out as silently as she had entered, but this time something shifted in Marcus's demeanor. Outside the courtroom, he faced a crowd of reporters, dodged questions and refused interviews. Back at his office, he reviewed the files again, this time slower, more deliberate. The anomalies grew louder the longer he stared at them. Inconsistencies in the timestamps, metadata logs with suspicious overlaps, most of all, the absence of any credible motive. Rebecca had a spotless record, no history of activism, no evidence of financial gain or ideological agenda. He visited her that evening at the detention facility. She sat across from him in the visitation room, still mute, still unwavering. "I filed the motions," he said, "better. But without your testimony, this is going to get worse before it gets." She looked at him with a calm that was almost otherworldly. There was no fear in her eyes, nor assignation, just clarity. "You could get help from someone," he continued. "There's got to be something you can give me. Anything. Someone else who knows what happened, nothing. I'm not asking you to confess. I'm asking you to let me protect you." Again, no response. Marcus leaned back, exhaustion written into every line of his face, pushing. "And you're giving them no reason to stop. They're going to keep outside." The media painted Rebecca's silence as either arrogance or guilt. Pundits debated her motives. Was she a whistleblower trying to expose government corruption, or was she simply guilty and hoping silence would make her harder to convict? But those questions missed the nuance Marcus had begun to sense. Her silence was not evasive. It was tactical. Not the absence of strategy, but the embodiment of one. In the days that followed, federal prosecutors intensified their efforts. New subpoenas were issued. Additional warrants were drafted. Rebecca's old office was raided. Her colleagues were questioned. Most knew little. She had always been private, focused, professional. No one could remember her speaking about politics or breaking protocol. But everyone remembered one thing. She had been working on something confidential in the months leading up to her arrest. A special project. Details were scarce, and no one could say exactly what it was. Marcus followed the thread. He filed requests to unseal older work logs, to retrieve communications from project leads. He even contacted a cybersecurity analyst to audit the access records independently. What he found was murky, a partial correspondence between Rebecca and a government sub-agency dealing with environmental compliance on federal lands. The trail was thin, but it hinted at something larger, buried beneath layers of bureaucratic silence. Still, none of it mattered if Rebecca continued to refuse help. The court granted Marcus access to additional resources, but not enough to mount a full private investigation. He needed more. He needed something explosive to turn the tide, and the only person who could provide that sat in a concrete cell, arms folded, watching time pass like it owed her nothing. She had refused the judge's invitation to speak, refused to bargain with the prosecutors, refused even to let Marcus shield her with the full scope of his defense. It was her first rejection of help, and it would not be the last. The fluorescent hum of the Federal Archive room echoed like a mechanical breath. Marcus Levy stood alone in the tight, climate-controlled space, staring at a monitor displaying Rebecca Collins's badge access logs. Digital entries filled the screen, each row marking a time, location, and terminal. The data was clean. Too clean. He scrolled to the night in question, the supposed breach. There it was. Her employee ID used 3 times within a 2-hour window. Terminal ID matches, server access confirmed, log files verified. Except, according to the documents he had in his briefcase, Rebecca was not even in the same state at the time. Marcus placed the printout of the hotel receipt from Chicago next to the digital log. It showed check-in at 9:42 in the evening, a signature from Rebecca, a surveillance photo. GPS data from her government-issued phone pinged the tower adjacent to the hotel at exactly 10:15. Her digital footprint was there, hundreds of miles away from the crime scene. He stared at the screen again, eyebrows drawing tight. Something was off. He went back 3 months in the logs, checking patterns. Rebecca had never accessed sensitive servers outside business hours before. Her workday usually ended by 6. The sudden activity after 10 o'clock at night, on a Sunday, was wildly out of character. And yet, none of that discrepancy had been flagged by the internal audit that triggered her arrest. He jotted notes, drawing connections between access, patterns, timing, and locations. He looked for IP inconsistencies, VPN flags, and terminal anomalies. But the system logs had been scrubbed, too clean again. The technical details had been smoothed over, stripped of their usual noise. That was the detail that didn't fit. In real data environments, there were always irregularities, latency, backups, pings. But this digital trail was frictionless. Artificial Marcus gathered the materials and left, deciding not to trust digital copies. He returned to his office and laid everything out: receipts, flight itineraries, phone pings, camera timestamps. Hecross referenced them with metadata from the leaked documents. That's when he saw it. The time zone stamp on one file did not match the rest. One document had been saved with Eastern Standard Time metadata, while all others were in Central. It was a tiny inconsistency, something only a seasoned analyst might notice. But it was there. He froze. That one file, the only one dated exactly during the window when Rebecca was in Chicago, had a metadata signature inconsistent with her usual work environment. He checked her department's IT logs. Her team used machines set to Central Time. But the device that had saved that one document was configured for Eastern. It meant the file had been edited or saved from a machine located in a different region or manually adjusted to reflect that zone. Marcus felt a surge of validation. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was a crack in the narrative. Someone had gone to great lengths to simulate Rebecca's involvement. But they had been careless with one timestamp. He returned to the detention center that evening. Rebecca was seated in the interview room, hands folded in front of her, posture unchanged. She looked up as he entered, but still she said nothing. Marcus spread out the documents on the table. "You were in Chicago," he said, pointing at the surveillance photo, "and someone used your credentials from here. But they missed one thing, a single file with a time zone error. That's the mistake that will open everything up." She blinked slowly but gave no response. "You know who did this," he said, voice low and even. "Maybe you've known the whole time. But you also know something bigger. That's why you're staying quiet. You're protecting something." Her gaze held his, unwavering. Marcus leaned back, exhausted. "You're not trying to win the legal battle. You're waiting for something else. But this file, this mistake, as it gives me leverage, I can force a hearing, I can slow them down." Still silence. He sighed, collected the papers, and stood. "I'll keep fighting this, even if you won't. Say a word." The next day, Marcus filed a motion with the court demanding a full forensic review of the digital evidence, citing inconsistencies in metadata and device configurations. He included the time zone anomaly, the travel documentation, and the unsupported assumption that Rebecca had used her home terminal that night. The judge, though skeptical, agreed to a limited review under the supervision of a neutral digital forensics expert The federal response was swift and defensive. They pushed back against the motion, claiming national security interests. But Marcus had introduced doubt, and that was enough for now. Meanwhile, media coverage grew more frenzied. Leaks emerged, vague, unnamed sources suggesting that Rebecca had been working on a classified project involving water contamination data linked to corporate contracts with federal agencies. No names were released, no specifics, but the public reaction shifted. Suddenly, the narrative began to fracture. Was she a scapegoat? In her cell, Rebecca continued her silence. She watched the guards. She listened to every footstep in the hall. Her eyes lingered a second longer on one visitor's shoes, a scuff on the toe, a loose thread. Every detail mattered. She wasn't waiting passively. She was counting. She knew the first error would appear. They always did. Digital lies left shadows, and now with a single timestamp that shadow had found its shape. The courtroom was already packed when the side doors opened, and a group of 3 sharply dressed individuals entered, their movements purposeful, expressions unreadable. They walked directly to the defense table without hesitation. Leading them was a woman in her early 50s, tall with salt-streaked hair pulled back into a precise twist. Eleanor Banks. The name carried weight in Washington and in courtrooms across the country. Known for dismantling entire federal cases with surgical precision, she had built her reputation in the unforgiving world of cybercrime defense. Her presence in Austin sent a ripple through the room. Rebecca Collins, seated with her back straight and her hands clasped, turned her head slightly as the new team took their place. She said nothing, as always, but her eyes lingered on Eleanor longer than usual. Not in surprise, not in confusion, but in recognition, as if this moment had been expected all along. Marcus Levy stood from the defense table and stepped aside, exchanging only a glance with Eleanor. There was no tension between them, only the tacit understanding of a transition already agreed upon. He gathered his files, nodded at Rebecca, who gave him the same unreadable expression she had maintained for weeks, and stepped away. Eleanor sat down without fanfare, placed a thin leather binder in front of her, and tapped once on the table to signal readiness. Her associates, one specializing in federal data integrity, the other in administrative law, sat beside her and began reviewing the digital evidence logs already submitted to the court. The judge, already briefed on the switch in counsel, called the court to order. The prosecution prepared to resume its arguments. But Eleanor stood immediately, voice calm, words precise. "Your Honor, before we proceed, the defense requests an emergency evidentiary review. New inconsistencies have been identified in the digital chain of custody involving the alleged data breach, including alterations to system access logs and metadata tampering on at least one classified document." The courtroom quieted. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Tampering? On what basis are you asserting?" Eleanor turned a page in her binder. A server log from the Department of Environmental Compliance indicates user access activity linked to Ms. Collins's credentials on a date when she was indisputably located in Chicago. Furthermore, a file timestamp saved with Eastern Standard metadata contradicts the Central Standard configuration of her agency's entire system architecture. That file, Your Honor, forms part of the prosecution's core evidence. Gasps rippled through the audience. The prosecutor objected immediately. These claims were already addressed during initial motions. They were dismissed as minor inconsistencies. Eleanor's tone did not shift. "Minor inconsistencies do not survive forensic audits. We have retained an independent cybersecurity consultant who has begun preliminary analysis. Early findings suggest insertion of falsified access logs into the digital trail following the breach." The judge reviewed the motion Eleanor had filed that morning. It included over 70 pages of technical detail, affidavits from 2 IT experts, and an annotated log showing discrepancies in session identifiers. She looked back at the prosecution. "Your response?" The lead prosecutor hesitated. "We were not informed of this motion until this morning. We request additional time to review the claims." Eleanor nodded once. "That is acceptable. We will proceed after your review. In the meantime, we move to suppress all evidence derived from the compromised server access logs until authentication is verified. The judge agreed to postpone the hearing, granting 72 hours for both sides to review the digital evidence under court-supervised technical experts. Eleanor's team had achieved in 1 hour what Marcus had been fighting for over weeks, an official re-evaluation of the prosecution's foundational data. As the courtroom emptied, Rebecca was led away in handcuffs, but something had changed. The usual stillness in her features remained, yet there was an unmistakable shift in her eyes, not defiance but anticipation. Back in the detention center, Eleanor met with her client for the first time behind closed doors. The guards remained outside. The room was small, with a steel table and 2 chairs. Eleanor sat across from Rebecca and opened the same binder she had carried into court. She said nothing for nearly a minute, merely studying the woman before her. "You did the right thing staying silent," Eleanor said eventually, voice low. "You were protecting something too big to explain in sound bites. You bought us time, now let me buy you justice." Rebecca didn't respond, but she didn't look away either. Eleanor continued, "We've already found the first crack. It's going to lead to the rest. Whoever inserted those logs knew the basics, but not enough. They forgot that metadata doesn't lie forever, especially not in archived backups." Still, Rebecca gave no answer. Eleanor closed the binder. "I don't need you to talk yet. I need you to trust me. The system is built to discredit people like you, people who get too close to secrets that were never meant to survive daylight. But if I'm right, you weren't just a witness. You were a warning." She stood to leave, but paused at the door. "We'll speak again after the audit. Until then, keep doing exactly what you've done. Stay quiet. Watch everything." Outside, her associates were already pulling more logs, requesting documents, filing subpoenas. They tracked down an IT contractor who had left the agency abruptly weeks before the breach. They reached out to environmental compliance officers whose names had been redacted from project memos. The defense no longer acted like a cornered party. It was now an advancing force, and the prosecution, once unshakable in its confidence, began to reconsider the foundation it had built, because backup had arrived and everything was about to change. By 2. The time the court-ordered forensic review began, Eleanor Banks's team was already 3 steps ahead. In a rented suite just blocks from the courthouse, the defense had set up a temporary operations base, complete with secure servers, whiteboards filled with timelines, and conference tables layered with documents, printouts, and digital storage devices. The room buzzed with quiet urgency. The team worked in coordinated silence, each member focused on their task, with Eleanor overseeing every thread. The digital forensic analyst hired by the defense, a former intelligence contractor named Robert Cheevers, had begun to extract deep metadata from the government's evidence. Within hours, his analysis confirmed Eleanor's suspicions. At least 2 access logs had been manually inserted into the audit chain post-incident. These entries appeared authentic to the untrained eye, but lacked system-generated hash verification. In simple terms, someone had doctored the logs after the fact, trying to simulate a seamless breach linked to Rebecca's credentials. Cheevers also discovered an unusual signature, a digital artifact from a proprietary toolset no longer in use by the agency. This tool had been discontinued years ago, yet here it was, leaving behind a fingerprint embedded in the log files. Its presence alone suggested that whoever had fabricated the evidence had used outdated internal software, likely salvaged from within the agency itself. Eleanor took the report and built a motion demanding the suppression of all digital evidence tainted by manual interference. In court, she presented Cheevers's findings with exacting clarity. She explained how tampering at the log level was not just sloppy, it was a red flag indicating a deliberate effort to manufacture guilt. The prosecution scrambled to respond, caught off guard by the technical depth of the motion. The judge, though cautious, allowed the hearing to proceed into evidentiary challenge phase. That decision marked a turning point. For the first time, the burden began to shift. The federal case no longer rested on a towering foundation of data. It now stood on contested ground, shaky and exposed. While the legal front advanced, Eleanor's second line of investigation pursued the origin of the leak itself. The environmental reports allegedly shared by Rebecca contained findings about industrial waste patterns on Native American lands, data that had never been meant for public release. Her associate, Daniel Morrow, traced the leak not to Rebecca's official files, but to a backup server used by a now-defunct interagency task force. The server logs had not been included in the prosecution's discovery materials. They had simply gone unmentioned. Upon examining this forgotten server, Daniel found access records linked not to Rebecca, but to another agency employee, someone who had left months earlier under obscure circumstances. This person had clearance but no current affiliation. Eleanor's team compiled a timeline showing that his login credentials had been used multiple times during the breach window and that his digital signature had been scrubbed from the audit. Logs provided to the court. With this information, Eleanor confronted the prosecution in a closed-door evidentiary meeting. She offered them the chance to withdraw certain charges before the defense forced public disclosure of the scrubbed records. The prosecutors refused, citing insufficient linkage between the alternate credentials and the leaked documents, but Eleanor had anticipated the denial. That evening, she filed a new motion, this time attaching internal memos between IT staff discussing a system revalidation following the breach. One memo included a buried line referencing manual reconstruction of log events, the clearest indication yet that the digital trail had been manipulated internally. Back in her cell, Rebecca was informed of the new developments during a brief meeting with Eleanor. As always, she listened in silence, her hands resting calmly on the table. But this time, as Eleanor outlined the chain of fabricated evidence and the recovered memo, something changed in Rebecca's demeanor. Her posture straightened, her gaze sharpened. She reached out slowly and turned one of the pages toward herself, the first physical interaction she had made with the evidence since her arrest. Eleanor noted the moment without comment. She understood its meaning. Rebecca had seen enough. She knew the signal. The defense had drawn blood. The counter-offensive was no longer a concept. It was active, coordinated, and escalating. Meanwhile, public opinion began to fracture. Independent journalists picked up on Eleanor's filings and began reporting on the suppressed evidence and altered logs. A few former agency insiders gave anonymous interviews, suggesting that the breach narrative had been simplified for political expediency. Social media shifted again, now questioning whether Rebecca's silence had been an act of defiance, a way to avoid implicating others too soon. At the next pre-trial conference, Eleanor entered the courtroom with confidence sharpened by discovery. She presented a consolidated timeline showing where Rebecca was, what devices she used, and which systems were accessed, and by whom. She pointed directly to the gap between official reports and verifiable data. The judge listened closely, no longer indifferent. The case, once considered airtight, now resembled a structure built on sand. The prosecution requested a continuance to respond to the expanding body of evidence. The judge granted it, but added a stern remark about the integrity of discovery materials. Eleanor's goal had been met: delay, expose, and unsettle. Each day that passed weakened the credibility of the original charges. And with every discovery Eleanor's team made, it became increasingly clear that Rebecca had not acted alone, not in any way that could be defined by guilt. If anything, she had been isolated precisely because of what she had uncovered and what she refused to say. Because the silence was no longer only about protection, it had become a weapon, and it was finally beginning to cut deep. In the third floor, Records Division of a nondescript federal annex building on the edge of Washington, D.C., an archivist named Daryl Keene scrolled through file directories on a terminal that had not been updated in years. The air was stale with dust and neglect. The files she was reviewing were not digitized summaries or sanitized public reports. These were original field notes, draft memos, internal reviews, and among them, he had just located a placeholder for a file that should have been there but was not. It was labeled only as Water Res Cient Redact 4710, a code that identified it as a restricted internal document tied to environmental compliance actions on federally protected land. The archive log showed it had been last accessed 7 months ago, then sealed under an interagency classification directive. No digital copy remained. The file had not been scanned or uploaded. And now, even the placeholder had no attached user. FATAG, an anomaly in a system built to track every movement. That was the missing dossier. 2 hours later, Eleanor Banks stood in the same room, holding a printed list of document codes, her voice low but firm. "You're certain this file existed?" Keane nodded, eyes darting toward the doorway as if worried someone might overhear. "I only found the reference because I was looking for field records on tribal lands, but when I clicked the link, it gave me an error I've never seen before. Not access denied, and not even filer restricted, just gone, like someone stripped the entire record." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. She already suspected that something vital had been erased from the government's internal chain of custody, but now she had confirmation. There was a record that had vanished, leaving behind only silence. And in that silence, truth had been buried. Back at her temporary office in Austin, she relayed the discovery to Daniel Morrow and Robert Cheevers. "This is what she's been protecting," Eleanor said. "It's not just about access logs or altered evidence. It's about whatever was in that file. And it's gone." Daniel began cross-referencing the document ID with older compliance reports. He discovered partial matches embedded in project memos from a now-defunct oversight unit. These memos mentioned unauthorized contaminants and unrecorded runoff near reservation borders in 3 western states. The language was vague, but the pattern clear. Data had been suppressed, field reports had been diluted, and someone had tied it all to an internal compliance effort that disappeared from the federal record. The more they pulled, the more they found. Truncated communications between regional offices, references to internal watch lists, and mentions of staff reassignment following whistleblower complaints. One such complaint came from a field agent, whose name appeared briefly in a redacted memo, then vanished entirely from personnel records 6 months later. Eleanor compiled the findings into a sealed summary and submitted a new motion. This one didn't challenge digital logs or metadata. It accused the government of withholding material evidence, specifically documentation pertaining to hazardous environmental activity on federal lands, and the resulting internal investigations that were never made public. She named the missing dossier. She submitted affidavits from the archivist and her own experts. In court, the prosecution objected immediately, claiming that no such file existed. The judge ordered a closed-door evidentiary hearing to examine the allegations. Behind those closed doors, Eleanor presented her case. Not speculation, but a chain of suppression that began the moment Rebecca's work intersected with a classified environmental oversight program. And that was the connection. Rebecca had not leaked federal secrets. She had uncovered them. Her project involved water contamination assessments along pipelines that crossed into tribal lands. Her team had discovered elevated toxin levels near waste storage sites, supposedly dormant for years. But instead of being published, her report had been diverted, sealed, and erased. When she pushed back, her access credentials were revoked temporarily. Weeks later, the breach was staged and she was arrested. It was all too clean, too fast. Eleanor's team had also uncovered an internal memo advising legal to contain exposure risk related to reservoir contamination anomalies. That phrase, exposure risk, was corporate language, not environmental protocol. It pointed to something more than oversight failure. It pointed to collusion. Now Eleanor turned to the final piece, the metadata discrepancy that first hinted at a planted file. Combined with the missing dossier, it created a timeline of intent. Someone had created the illusion of a leak to discredit the woman who had uncovered a real one. Back at the detention facility, Rebecca remained silent. But the shift was visible now. Guards treated her with less suspicion. She was moved from isolation into a monitored dormitory wing. Word had spread that the defense had struck something deep. The public narrative, once hostile, had fragmented. Articles appeared questioning the government's version of events. Environmental. Groups filed public record requests for information on the contamination sites. Tribal leaders issued statements demanding transparency. The press began asking why no one could explain the missing file, or why Rebecca had been the only person arrested when so many others had touched the same data. Inside her cell, Rebecca sat on her bunk, reading a copy of the court filing Eleanor had sent her. She traced her finger across the printed title, "Motion to Disclose Sealed Environmental Oversight Records." She stared at the name of the file at the center of it all, and she smiled, not wide, not for long, but enough. She had known they would find it, eventually. She had built the silence around it, layer by layer. And now, the silence had cracked. It was just after 6 o'clock in the evening when Daniel Morrow's terminal pinged with a response from a database query he had submitted 3 days prior. The search had targeted deprecated access points used by federal employees no longer active in environmental oversight. Most came back empty, but one result stood out. A masked IP flagged in a closed investigation from 5 years ago had appeared twice in recent logs, once in the breach attributed to Rebecca Collins, and once, weeks before, during an unscheduled audit of a secondary server hosting tribal water reports. The IP resolved to a residential location in Virginia, and the name linked to the service provider was Jason Rourke. Eleanor stood over Daniel's shoulder, reading the name aloud. It echoed in her memory like a door creaking open. Jason Rourke, a former systems engineer for the Environmental Protection Agency, suspended, not fired, after internal allegations of data manipulation were raised but never prosecuted. His departure had coincided with the dissolution of the oversight unit that once monitored pipeline runoff in restricted zones. Eleanor requested his personnel file. The documents showed a sharp decline in his performance evaluations during the last year of his employment, followed by a sealed addendum labeled Internal Review Complete. But what struck her most wasn't the review. It was a scanned note at the bottom of one of the pages. It was a reference letter written by Rebecca Collins. The signature was unmistakable. In the letter, Rebecca described Rourke as a valuable contributor in early-stage environmental impact modeling, praising his ability to synthesize code into practical field applications. It was dated 6 years ago, long before any allegations had surfaced. The connection between them was professional, collegial, perhaps even more. The discovery reframed everything. Eleanor called a meeting with her legal team that night. They projected timelines across the walls, charted access logs, emails, and project milestones. It all revolved around one axis: Rourke. If someone had the technical capability to simulate a breach and impersonate Rebecca's credentials, it would have been him. The use of legacy software, the time zone mismatches, the forged logs, all consistent with someone who once had unrestricted access and deep knowledge of internal systems. But the question remained, why would he do it? They traced his post-termination history. No formal employment records, no known address until 2 years ago, several unexplained travel records, all within states that housed key pipeline junctions. One photo surfaced, a grainy image from an activist blog, capturing a blurry man at a protest outside a federal building in Utah. He was never named, never identified, but the resemblance was strong. Eleanor hesitated to speculate. Motives were dangerous terrain in court without evidence, but patterns could be presented, connections could be drawn, and what they had now wasn't speculation, it was a map. The next morning, she filed a motion to request an interview with Jason Rourke under subpoena. The prosecution resisted, arguing that he was not a material witness. The judge disagreed. The pattern was too clear, the evidence too aligned. Rourke would be brought in. Meanwhile, Rebecca remained in custody. Word of the subpoena reached her through Eleanor, who met her in the same small interview room as before. For the first time, Eleanor noticed something behind the silence, a flicker of urgency, not panic, but a sharpening, as if a quiet warning had just been confirmed. You knew he was out there, Eleanor said. You knew. You didn't name him. You didn't accuse him. But Rebecca didn't nod. She didn't speak. But she opened her hands flat on the table the smallest signal of acceptance. You trusted him once, Eleanor continued. Maybe you still do. Still, no words came, but the pause held weight, heavy with old truths. Later that day, as the subpoena was processed, Eleanor's team discovered one final piece, an encrypted email buried in the backup logs of Rebecca's work terminal dated weeks before the breach. It had never been opened. The system had auto-archived it due to inactivity. The sender was anonymous. The subject line read only, "You need to disappear." Inside, the message was short. "They're going to shut it down. They know what you found. I covered your access. You're clear for now, but you need to stay quiet." Eleanor's fingers tightened on the page. It was not an accusation. It was a confession. Back in the courtroom, pressure mounted. Journalists buzzed around the new subpoena. The prosecution tried to regain control of the narrative, but they had already begun to fracture. The case was slipping from their hands, and all the while Rebecca said nothing. But in that silence now lived a storm of revelations. Her connection to Rourke, the buried email, the altered logs, the missing dossier. The falsified narrative was collapsing under the weight of its own secrets. The system that had arrested her, shamed her, isolated her, had failed to account for one thing. That silence could hold truth more dangerous than any testimony, and now that truth was being dragged into the light, piece by piece, name by name, betrayal by betrayal. The morning of the trial dawned gray, the sky low and heavy over the courthouse steps. Barricades held back a crowd of journalists, activists, and curious onlookers. Rebecca Collins arrived in a dark suit provided by her legal team, wrists uncuffed for the first time in months. She walked calmly beside Eleanor Banks, the two flanked by federal officers. No handcuffs, no visible restraints, just the quiet tension of everything that had built to this moment. Inside, the courtroom was filled to capacity. Spectators sat shoulder to shoulder, while camera crews operated under limited access, feeding national newsrooms a steady stream of images. The prosecution team arrived early, placing boxes of documents on their table, whispering among themselves. Their lead counsel, Thomas Granger, stood like a soldier before battle, rehearsing his opening lines beneath his breath. Eleanor sat beside Rebecca, opening her notes but barely glancing at them. Her focus was note on paper. It was on the space, on the silence before testimony, on the patterns of movement and glance, on Rebecca. The judge entered promptly and called the court to order. After preliminary remarks, the jury was seated, 7 women, 5 men, all briefed, all sworn. Then the trial began. Granger opened with confident rhythm. He outlined the allegations in clear, measured terms: unauthorized access, classified, environmental data, malicious distribution, breach of federal cybersecurity protocols. He described the digital trail as irrefutable, the timeline as exact, the damage as real. He spoke of trust broken, systems compromised, and the national interest endangered. His tone was not inflammatory. It was deliberate, controlled, the voice of institutional power presenting a story that, until now, had not been formally challenged in full view. When he finished, Eleanor rose. She did not pace. She did not raise her voice. Instead, she spoke of silence, not as defiance, but as discipline. She told the jury that silence had kept Rebecca alive, that it had shielded not just her, but the truth she carried, that sometimes the absence of words revealed more than language ever could. Then she turned the narrative. She spoke of metadata, fabricated access logs, scrubbed documents. She named Jason Rourke. She referenced the missing dossier. She painted a portrait of a system more interested in protecting its own secrets than delivering justice. She is not on trial because of what she did, Eleanor said. She is on trial because of what she found. The first days of testimony began with technical experts, both prosecution and defense, arguing over access logs, timestamps, server trails. Eleanor's team dismantled each claim with precision. Robert Cheevers took the stand and calmly explained the signature left behind by obsolete software, the time zone mismatches, the artificial sequence of data entries that indicated manipulation. The prosecution cross-examined him aggressively, but he never wavered. Midway through the second week, Jason Rourke appeared. His subpoena had been enforced, his appearance reluctant. He walked to the witness stand with slow, measured steps, glancing once at Rebecca before being sworn in. His testimony was guarded. He acknowledged working with Rebecca years ago. He admitted he had access to internal systems during his tenure, but he denied involvement in the breach. He claimed no knowledge of any missing dossier. He said the last time he contacted Rebecca had been long before any of this began. Then Eleanor showed him the email. "You need to disappear." Rourke's expression faltered. Granger objected, citing authenticity concerns, but the judge allowed it under verified forensic confirmation. Eleanor asked again, "Did you send this?" Rourke didn't answer at first. Then, slowly, "I was trying." To warn her. Warn her of what? Another pause. That they were going to erase everything. His admission landed like a dropped stone in water, silent at first. Then, rippling outward, the courtroom murmured. The jury watched, unmoving. Eleanor pressed, "You used her credentials. I didn't mean to frame her, but you did." He didn't answer. That night, Rourke was detained for questioning regarding obstruction and digital fraud. The trial resumed the next day with the mood changed entirely. The prosecution pushed harder, tried to pivot, but the damage was done. The breach was no longer just about data. It was about truth, and the lengths taken to bury it. Rebecca still had not spoken, not during the proceedings, not to the media, not to the court, until the final week. It was a decision made between her and Eleanor in private behind closed doors, and when the day arrived, the courtroom held its breath as she rose and walked to the stand. She took the oath with a steady voice. Then she sat composed, hands folded in her lap. "I tried," she began, voice low but clear. "I tried to warn them from the inside." The courtroom fell into stillness. I wrote reports. I filed concerns. I followed protocol. But each time, the data was diluted, the urgency downplayed, the findings redirected. And then one day it all disappeared. She detailed her project. Contamination patterns in water reserves bordering tribal lands, correlations with private waste contracts, anomalies that should have triggered immediate investigation but were instead concealed. "I didn't leak anything," she said. "I was silenced before I could." She paused, then looked at the jury. "I stayed silent because I knew if I spoke too early they would twist it. I waited until the evidence could speak with me." The prosecution cross-examined her, but each question only clarified her integrity. She answered without hesitation, without fear. Her silence had ended, but not because she had been broken, because the moment had arrived, because the story was ready to be heard, on her terms, and the room knew it, so did the jury. The courtroom sat in hushed anticipation as the final week of testimony unfolded. The prosecution had begun to fracture, their narrative no longer sharp, their tone less certain. Every assertion they made now felt like a fragile defense, rather than an aggressive offense. The turning point had not been loud or theatrical. It had arrived in the stillness of Rebecca's voice and the irrevocable truth of her words. But Eleanor, Banks knew that trials did not end in sentiment. They ended in strategy. And so she pushed further. She requested a full review of the internal audit chain from the Environmental Protection Agency, focusing on the secondary servers where Rebecca's research had been stored. The judge, under pressure from a restless jury and mounting public scrutiny, granted the request. The files arrived in encrypted format, heavily redacted in their first layer. But Cheevers decrypted the metadata logs beneath. What they discovered was stunning. Internal communications between mid-level agency officials discussing risk mitigation and document reduction. One message contained a time-stamped directive to eliminate project tags tied to tribal jurisdiction evaluations. Another referenced contractual sensitivity involving industrial stakeholders. It was, in effect, a blueprint for suppression. These files had never been submitted in discovery. Their absence alone was grounds for sanctions. Eleanor brought this before the court, requesting that the jury be allowed to review the suppressed communications under judicial supervision. The judge agreed. When the messages were read aloud, the effect was immediate. The courtroom murmured as phrases echoed through the space: containment of political fallout, preemptive personnel audit, silencing risk vectors. Each line undermined the prosecution's narrative. Each phrase pointed directly to an effort not to prosecute wrongdoing, but to prevent it from ever being seen. And then came the final blow. A recording, uncovered by Eleanor's team on a forgotten server linked to the oversight division Rebecca once served. It had been stored as a test file with a generic label. It was an audio memo, internal, never meant to be heard outside the agency. The voice belonged to a compliance officer who had resigned months before the breach. We flagged the contamination spikes in 3 separate zones. Collins submitted the proper escalation forms, but those were intercepted. Orders came down to freeze the data and terminate the report path. We were told not to question it. When Collins asked for an independent review, she was removed from the project. The courtroom stilled as the last sentence played back again. She was removed from the project. Granger stood and objected, but his voice lacked conviction. The judge overruled him. The jury sat frozen. The narrative had now reversed entirely. Rebecca Collins had not breached federal data. She had been targeted by those who had. Eleanor turned the final week of proceedings into a meticulous deconstruction of every lie used to justify Rebecca's arrest. She recalled witnesses from earlier in the trial, not to repeat their testimony, but to force them to reconcile it against the new evidence. Faces shifted. Statements collapsed under contradiction. And slowly, the figure at the center of the accusations became no longer the perpetrator, but the casualty. Throughout it all, Rebecca remained composed. She no longer needed to defend herself. The evidence had done it for her, but it was not vindication that marked her face. It was something quieter, something heavier. Outside the courtroom, the tide shifted irreversibly. News outlets ran special segments dissecting the recordings, publishing timelines showing exactly when the suppression began and who had participated. Environmental groups filed lawsuits, congressional oversight committees announced hearings, and public trust, already frayed, began to unravel further. Within the courthouse, the prosecution submitted a final, desperate motion, a request to reduce the scope of charges, arguing that even if certain evidence had been compromised, national security concerns still justified partial conviction. Eleanor responded not with anger, but with clarity. There is no middle ground between innocence and fabrication. What they are asking for is the preservation of a lie to cover the collapse of a larger one. The judge declined the prosecution's motion. The jury was sent to deliberate. They took 2 days, 48 hours of silence. Outside, speculation surged. Inside, calm held. Rebecca waited not with expectation, but with understanding. She had endured isolation, false accusation, media vilification. She had chosen silence not as a void, but as a space to protect what she knew until it could stand on its own, and now it had. The jury returned, faces solemn. The judge read the verdict, not guilty on all counts. A wave of noise surged behind the walls of the courtroom. Reporters scrambled, activists wept. Inside, Rebecca remained motionless. Eleanor placed a hand lightly on her arm, but said nothing. The moment belonged not to her, not to the courtroom, but to the silence that had carried them there. The judge dismissed the case. The charges were voided. The record was sealed, and the system that had tried to bury her was now on trial in the court of public opinion. As she walked out of the courthouse, sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time in days. Rebecca paused at the steps, breathing it in. There were no cameras in her face. Eleanor had ensured her exit would be quiet, because some stories do not end in spectacle. They end with truth reclaimed, and the silence left behind. Weeks passed after the verdict, and the headlines began to shift. Rebecca Collins's name was no longer attached to accusations or scandal, but to the term wrongfully accused. News anchors moderated interviews with legal analysts who dissected every stage of the trial, pointing out failures in due process, in evidence handling, in internal oversight. Editorials began appearing in national papers, questioning how many others had been silenced without the benefit of Eleanor Banks's caliber of defense. Congressional hearings were announced, federal review, panels were formed, but amidst the noise, Rebecca remained absent from public life. Her release had not been followed by a press tour. She had declined every interview, refused every request for a statement, ignored every outreach from documentary producers. Instead, she moved to a quiet apartment just outside Santa Fe, in the hills where cell reception was, scarce, and the nights were filled with wind instead of questions. The place had been arranged by Eleanor, remote, discreet, temporary, a space to breathe, a space to be. Those who had known her before, colleagues, neighbors, former classmates, reached out with messages of support, some apologizing for having doubted her, others simply writing to say they believed her now. She responded to none of them, not out of bitterness, but necessity. The damage done had not been social, it had been systemic, and healing from that would require silence of a different kind. Eleanor visited once during those early weeks. They didn't talk much, they didn't need to. The bond formed through the trial had never been based on shared history or affection, but on trust. The rare, quiet kind forged under pressure. Eleanor delivered updates. Several of the officials named in the trial had been placed under investigation. The internal memo about risk mitigation had triggered a federal ethics inquiry, and Jason Rourke, after weeks of interrogation, had agreed to testify before Congress about the digital cover-up in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Rebecca listened but gave no opinion. Eleanor understood. This wasn't closure, it was simply consequence. Back in Washington, the legal community continued to feel the impact. Defense attorneys began citing the Collins case as precedent when challenging the validity of digital evidence. Analysts published articles on the dangers of metadata manipulation. A new task force was created to oversee the chain of custody protocols for interagency data transfers. Quiet reforms emerged, not in sweeping legislation, but in revised procedures and amended training materials. But none of it made the news that Rebecca paid attention to. Instead, she returned to the work that had defined her before the silence. She began researching water contamination cases again, this time privately, under a foundation grant offered by an environmental group that had followed her case closely. She accepted under one condition: no public acknowledgement. Her reports would be published anonymously, reviewed by peer committees, submitted to regulatory agencies without fanfare. She didn't want credit. She wanted correction. In the quiet of her new routine, she began reading again, not legal documents or court transcripts, but scientific journals, ecological treatises, historical accounts of land stewardship by indigenous communities. Her curiosity had never dulled. It had simply been buried beneath the necessity of defense. One afternoon, walking a remote stretch of desert land with a water testing kit in her hand, she paused at the edge of a dry arroyo. She knelt, collected a sample, and noted the coordinates in her notebook. No cameras, no witnesses, just truth and data, the same way it had started. Occasionally she thought of the courtroom, of the moment she broke her silence, of the jurors' eyes locked on her as she spoke the truth, not to clear her name, but to clear the air. Toramov, the weight of unspoken knowledge from the space between accusation and fact. She didn't regret waiting. She had known the danger of speaking too early, and now, having waited, she had reclaimed her voice on her terms. Eleanor kept her informed about the legal aftermath. The agency responsible for the erasure of the dossier had faced administrative overhauls. Several private contractors had been suspended. 2 were preparing settlements to avoid public lawsuits. It wasn't justice in the cinematic sense, but it was accountability. And in the slow machinery of policy and reform, it mattered. Eventually, the press moved on. Other stories took precedence. Rebecca's name no longer trended. She had been vindicated, and now she had vanished again, not into obscurity, but into a life defined by purpose instead of survival. In the community where she now lived, she was known only as a private researcher. She kept to herself, paid in cash when possible, avoided digital footprints. Her home had no internet. Her car was second-hand, but her work continued. She sent data reports under a coded signature. Each file contained meticulous notes, detailed analysis, and recommendations for remediation. She received no replies. That was the arrangement: anonymous contribution, zero visibility, maximum impact. And so she moved through the world without announcement. Not hiding, not afraid, just free. Because after all the noise, after the courtroom battles and the national scrutiny, the most radical act left was to resume her life with integrity intact. 2. Build something new in the silence she had protected. To walk forward without seeking applause. To heal, not by forgetting, but by continuing. The congressional hearing chamber in Washington was austere and bright, lined with flags and dark wooden panels. It was built for spectacle, though its rituals were slow and its tone often ceremonial. On this particular morning, the air was dense with anticipation. Senators reviewed their questions, journalists checked their devices, activists filled the public gallery, faces focused and still. The name on the schedule had circulated in whispers for days. She had declined appearances before. She had refused statements. But now, months after her acquittal and retreat from public life, Rebecca Collins was here. Voluntarily. She entered the room without escort, dressed in the same grey suit she had worn during the first day of her trial. There was no announcement, no preamble. She stepped to the witness table, adjusted the microphone, hand placed a single folder before her. Then she looked at the chairwoman and nodded. The chairwoman raised her gavel, struck once, and called the hearing to order. "Ms. Collins," she began, "you may proceed with your statement." Rebecca leaned forward. Her voice, when it came, was steady. She did not raise it, she didn't need to. For several years, I worked in environmental systems analysis under federal contracts. My role was technical, to assess contamination, risks, analyze chemical patterns, and report anomalies. I was never trained in politics, I didn't attend law school. I didn't imagine myself here. A quiet settled over the chamber. I followed protocols, I escalated concerns, I filed internal reports. What I found was consistent and dangerous. Elevated toxin levels in protected lands, linked to industrial activity that had not been disclosed. When I pushed for transparency, the reports were sealed, the project was shut down. My access was revoked. She paused, letting that settle. Shortly after, I was arrested under federal suspicion of leaking classified documents. I did not leak anything. I did not break any law. But the system around me broke, and when it did, it used silence as both a weapon and a shield. She opened the folder and withdrew a single page. This is a copy of the first report I submitted, months before the breach. It was reviewed, acknowledged, and buried. Every recommendation I made was ignored. Every warning was removed from circulation. Not because it was inaccurate, but because it was inconvenient. She slid the page forward. During my trial, I remained silent. Not because I lacked defense, but because I lacked space. There was no room for facts in a process shaped by assumption. Speaking would not have saved me. Waiting did. A murmur rippled through the room, quickly hushed. Rebecca's eyes moved across the panel of senators. This is not a speech about injustice. It's about infrastructure, not roads or wires, but the infrastructure of truth. The channels through which truth moves or fails to. If those channels are blocked by fear, by politics, by profit, then even the most accurate data is meaningless. She reached into the folder again and placed down 3 sealed envelopes. These are names of former colleagues who tried to speak up before I did. They were directed, reassigned, or dismissed. Some were pressured into silence. One left the country. None of them had trials. None of them had Eleanor Banks. At the mention of the name, several heads turned toward the gallery, where Eleanor sat with her hands clasped in her lap. Rebecca continued, "This hearing is not about exoneration. That already happened. This is about responsibility. The system didn't just fail to protect the truth, it actively removed it. That cannot be repaired with apologies." She leaned back slightly, allowing the stillness to return. "I will not pursue restitution. I will not publish a memoir. I will not monetize this experience. What I ask, what I insist, is that you audit the agencies involved, unseal the remaining records, and implement protocols to ensure no future analyst is criminalized for doing their job." She paused once more. "You can't legislate courage, But you can legislate access. You can create systems that don't depend on whistleblowers risking everything. You can normalize transparency instead of rewarding suppression. She folded her hands and looked directly into the camera lenses. I spoke today because silence did its job. It protected the truth until you were ready to hear it. Then she stood, without waiting to be dismissed. The room was silent. No one moved. No gavel sounded. She walked out with the same calm that had carried her through every stage of the ordeal. Not triumphant, not defeated, whole. Outside the chamber, reporters waited, microphones raised. She passed through them without a word. In the days that followed, the hearings continued. The names she provided led to further testimonies, some closed, some public. Investigations deepened. Contracts were frozen. Data was unsealed. But Rebecca remained invisible. She returned to her work, to the quiet place where rivers and minerals still told the truth in patterns too small for headlines. But the impact of her words endured. Lawmakers cited her testimony in committee memos. Environmental reforms gained momentum, in corners of government long stagnant, and in places she would never visit. Young analysts read her report and saw something rare. Not just a record of what had gone wrong, but a model for what might go right. If truth could be heard and protected without the silence that cost so much to maintain. In that final act, Rebecca Collins spoke not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced before her. And then, as always, she let the silence return. But this time, it was not a defense. It was a legacy.